The afterlife of Catherine Howard. The tragic fate of Catherine Howard unfolds as we delve into the events surrounding her execution and its grim aftermath. Catherine Howard, the fifth Queen of Henry VIII, faced a gruesome end due to accusations of adultery against the king, both before and during her marriage. Despite her youth, her death was a brutal, heart-wrenching, and ultimately unjust one. In this narrative, we won't dwell on the reasons behind Catherine's demise. Instead, we will focus on the day of her execution and the harrowing events that followed her death. Join us today as we explore the horrifying posthumous experiences of Catherine Howard. To support our channel, please subscribe. Catherine received the news that her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday, the 13th of February, 1542. She was instructed to prepare herself spiritually for her impending death, which was set to occur at 9 o'clock the following morning. The night before her execution, Catherine devoted hours to fervent prayer. It is also believed that she practiced placing her head on the execution block to prepare herself mentally. Catherine even requested the block to be brought to the chamber so she could familiarize herself with it, a request that was granted. On the fateful morning of the 13th of February, Catherine rose early and made her way from her prison chamber to the scaffold erected for her execution. Witnesses reported that she appeared terrified and pale as she approached. Catherine's fear was palpable, and she required assistance to climb the scaffold stairs. Once on the platform, she was so weak that she could barely speak. Despite her distress, she acknowledged that she deserved 100 deaths for offending the king, who had shown her great kindness. She implored all Christian people to recognize the justness of her punishment for her transgressions against God and her continual defiance of his commandments and the king's royal authority throughout her life. Throughout history, there has been a rumor that Catherine uttered, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," while on the scaffold. However, her fear had overwhelmed her to the point that she struggled to speak clearly. The executioner then provided her with a blindfold, which she placed over her eyes. As Catherine had rehearsed the night before, she knelt down and positioned her head on the block. A large crowd had gathered to witness her execution, and there was an audible gasp as the executioner, wielding an exceptionally sharp axe, prepared to strike. In one swift and horrifying moment, the executioner severed Catherine's head from her body. At this moment, the executioner, in a gruesome display, lifted Catherine's head by her hair and removed her blindfold. He raised her lifeless face before the crowd and declared, "God save the king." Afterward, Catherine's lifeless body was entrusted to her attendants, who covered her with a sombre black cloak. She was then taken to the chapel of St. Peter and Vicula, a place constructed during the Tudor era. Within this chapel, a grim repository of historical truths about the era lies. Here, not only Catherine Howard, but also Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey rest, all queens who met their demise and suffered injustices at the hands of those in power. However, the victims within the chapel extend beyond the queens, as many more who lost their lives during Tudor monarchy and interred there. Within these hallowed walls, secrets are unveiled, and Catherine's story does not conclude with her execution on the orders of King Henry VIII. Instead, it takes a more sinister turn. Even before her death, Catherine was subjected to treatment that showcased the king's lack of affection for her. When compared to Anne Boleyn's death, both brutal in nature, Anne was afforded a swift execution by a French swordsman, while Catherine faced beheading by a blunt axe. Anne's scaffold was adorned with luxurious velvet and expensive fabrics, while Catherine's was merely covered in straw and hay to absorb her blood. Catherine was denied even a cushion to kneel on, and her royal titles were stripped from her before she left Hampton Court Palace. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting shrouded her body in black cloth and carried it into the chapel for burial. But there was no grand ceremony, no ornate chest for her interment. Instead, she was unceremoniously cast into a grave without a funeral. However, the cruelty didn't end there. What followed was sadistic and inhumane. Allegedly, when Catherine was buried and wrapped in her cloak, a substantial amount of quicklime was callously shovelled into her grave. It is believed that Henry VIII ordered this action. The consequence of this was the gradual dissolution of Catherine's body and remains, reducing them to near nothingness. It is almost as if someone wished for all traces of Catherine Howard to be obliterated from this earth, as if the king wanted her memory and history erased as if she had never existed. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel where Catherine Howard was interred underwent significant renovations. Queen Victoria was greatly disturbed to discover that the chapel was being used as a meeting room, a purpose she found wholly inappropriate. Consequently, she ordered extensive restoration work for the chapel. The small church was substantially improved, as Queen Victoria believed it was not suitable for its intended purpose, nor was it befitting for the burial of royalty or other high-ranking individuals who rested there. During these restoration efforts, the chapel's floor needed to be lifted, prompting builders to exhume the bodies of those laid near the altar and the high chancel. Among those whose remains were uncovered were individuals who had been executed within the walls of the Tower of London. Skilled doctors managed to identify some of the bodies, including that of Anne Boleyn and several others, such as Margaret Pole and Lady Rochford, who had been executed shortly after Catherine Howard. Once identified, these bodies were carefully placed in boxes and relocated for safekeeping while the renovations proceeded. However, what perplexed the builders was the absence of any remains that could be attributed to Catherine Howard. It had been assumed that she was buried in close proximity to the high altar due to her societal status. Typically in churches, the most significant burials are beneath or near the altar. The absence of Catherine Howard's remains strongly suggests that quicklime was used to accelerate her decomposition after her execution. In close proximity to the resting place of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, several eroded bones were discovered, possibly due to the effects of lime, but they could not conclusively be linked to Catherine Howard. To this day, Catherine's remains remain undiscovered. Nonetheless, inside the chapel of St. Peter and Fecula, next to Anne Boleyn's resting place, Catherine's cousin, there lies a plaque displaying her coat of arms and bearing her name. Quicklime, a potent chemical, would have quickened the decomposition process if it was used on Catherine's body, leaving little trace of her remains. It is truly heart-wrenching to contemplate the fate of Catherine, who in her youth became a victim of the ruthless and infamous King Henry VIII. While it cannot be denied that her relationship with Thomas Culpeper was inappropriate, it became evident that she shared more common ground with the courtier than with the grotesque king to whom she was wed. The Victorians lent credence to the theory that Catherine's remains were concealed with quicklime. However, some historians propose an alternative possibility, suggesting that her body might have been misidentified as Anne Boleyn's. Catherine's life was marked by horror, sadness, and brutality, but her treatment following her death can only be described as abominable, terrifying, and reprehensible. The memorial marker within the chapel serves as a tribute to the former Queen Consort. However, the truth remains that although Catherine's body was never recovered, there is a possibility that she rests somewhere beneath the church floor, a place yet undiscovered. Catherine met her tragic end at the hands of an executioner under the orders of a tyrannical king when she was just 18 or 19 years old. She was a young woman filled with potential, a stark reminder of what might have been had she never crossed paths with the king. Unfortunately, her marriage proved to be a catalyst for her transformation into a tragic victim, subjected to the malevolent forces at play.